Picture this. A woman in a black Chanel dress, pearls still sitting perfectly against her collarbone, is on her knees, on her own porch, a shattered champagne glass at her feet, while two unmarked sedans and a county detective's cruiser roll up the gravel drive behind her, red and blue light washing across her face like the end of the world arriving on schedule. That woman is my mother. 3 days ago, she buried me. She had the programs printed. She had the casket closed. She had my name carved into a headstone that was never going to hold a body, because I was never in the ground to begin with. My name is Major Elena Winters, United States Army, Special Operations Medical Command, and this is the story of how my own mother declared me dead to steal a farm full of broken soldiers, and how I let her keep believing it, right up until the moment I didn't. Rewind with me. 3 days earlier, before any of this, before the sirens, before the shattered glass, before the sedans in the driveway, I was sitting in a private debrief lounge at Joint Base Andrews, still wearing the plain civilian clothes Army CID hands you when your uniform has been cut off you in a field hospital and your dog tags are logged into an evidence bag. Across the low table sat General Thomas Ashford, 4 stars on a man who had commanded me since I was a second lieutenant with more nerve than sense. He had no official reason to be there. He'd come because 11 years earlier, in a burning aid station outside a city I'm still not allowed to name, I had kept his son alive with a chest tube and a prayer. And men like Ashford don't forget who pulled their blood out of the dirt. "You've been gone 8 months, Major," he said, turning a coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Officially, you've been dead for 6 of them." He wasn't cruel about it, just precise, the way men like him always are. A communications blackout during an extraction gone sideways had triggered an automatic casualty notification. The Army's own systems, moving faster than the truth, had listed me as killed in action before anyone confirmed a body. It happens more than the public knows. Usually it gets corrected within 72 hours. Mine took 8 months to correct because someone, somewhere, had made absolutely sure it didn't get corrected any faster than it had to. Someone with access to the exact desk where a casualty file waits for a live signature before it can become official, and every reason to make sure that signature came late. Those 8 months weren't empty ones for me, even if the paperwork said otherwise. I'd spent them attached to a joint task force in a valley I still dream about, keeping a 19-year-old private alive on a floor that used to be someone's kitchen, holding pressure on a wound with my bare hands, while the walls shook from something none of us were ever going to talk about outside a classified debrief. I came home lighter than I left, in every sense of that word, 11 pounds thinner, and missing whatever soft, forgiving part of a person usually flinches when they find out their own family sold their memory for a payday. I had already left that part of myself somewhere in that valley. What was waiting for me back home just made sure I never went looking for it again. Before I tell you what that someone did with those 8 months, take a second and hit like on this video, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Somewhere out there, someone watching this has buried a person who wasn't finished living yet, buried them with lies, not with dirt. And I want to know I'm not the only one who stood in that particular kind of silence. General Ashford slid a tablet across the table. On it was a scanned casualty notification letter, the kind sent to next of kin, stamped with a signature that was not mine, dated 4 months into my disappearance, requesting expedited release of my service members' group life insurance, $400,000. Sitting beside it, a second document, a quitclaim deed, also bearing a signature that looked exactly like mine, transferring full ownership of Winters Hollow Farm, 41 acres in the Shenandoah Valley, that I had bought with combat pay, a medical patent royalty, and 11 years of not spending money on anything but bootlaces and antibiotics, into the name of a private trust, controlled by my mother and a man named Roland Pruitt. I want to be clear about something before I go further, because I know exactly how this sounds. My hands did not shake when I read that. 8 months in the dark, watching men I love bleed out in places that don't exist on any map you've ever seen, does something to the part of you that used to panic. What was left in me when I read those forged pages had nothing to do with grief. It was a very old, very patient, very cold kind of clarity. The kind you only get after the last soft tissue in your chest has been cauterized shut by things worse than paperwork. Roland Pruitt, my stepfather's younger brother, the step-uncle my mother had folded into our family like a stray dog she found useful, a man who'd spent 30 years selling annuities to widows at the VFW hall and calling it financial ministry. I'd known him my whole life as the uncle who showed up at every holiday with a briefcase instead of a gift, always talking about opportunities, always looking at my father's old land like a man doing math in his head. I hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. I hadn't needed to. I was 3,000 miles away, keeping other people's sons alive, while he apparently spent that time keeping himself very, very busy. "There's more," Ashford said, "and there's always more with men like Roland." He turned the tablet again. An event invitation, cream cardstock, gold script. "You are cordially invited to a celebration of service and sacrifice, honoring the life of Major Elena R. Winters and the future of Winters Hollow Farm. Saturday, 2 days from now. Location, my farm. Hosted by my mother, Judith Halloway, and my stepfather's family." RSVP list included 3 sitting county commissioners, the regional director of a veterans charity network, and a dozen names I recognized from the donor circuit, people with the kind of money that turns into headlines when it's given away publicly. They weren't just stealing a dead woman's insurance money, they were throwing a gala on her grave to raise more. I need to take you back further, because you won't understand what that farm meant, or why this particular theft was the one that finally cracked something in me that 8 years of war never touched. Ashford let me sit with that for a moment before he said anything else. And to understand why I said nothing back to him yet, you need to understand what that farm actually was. When I was 9 years old, my mother married a man named Gerald Halloway, and 11 months later she gave him a son, my half-brother Preston. And from that day forward, the house I grew up in ran on a very simple arithmetic. Preston was the future. I was overhead. My mother used to say it with a smile so warm that strangers thought it was affection. Elena's built different. She doesn't need soft things the way Preston does. What that meant, in practice, was that Preston got braces, piano lessons, a car at 16, and a trust fund seeded by my late father's life insurance. The man who died when I was 6, whose money was legally mine, quietly redirected to family expenses that never once included me. What I got was a scholarship application I filled out myself at 14, and a recruiter's business card I kept folded in my sock drawer until the day I turned 18 and used it. I hadn't joined the army to serve my country, not at first. I joined because it was the only door in my life nobody in my family had their hand on. It took the desert and the mountains and 11 years of watching boys my own age come home in flag-draped boxes to turn that escape into a calling. Somewhere in there, I stopped being the girl running away from a house that didn't want her and became a woman who ran toward the worst days of other people's lives because she knew, better than almost anyone alive, what it felt like to need someone and have no one come. I still remember the exact night I decided I was leaving and never looking back. I was 17, and I'd come home from a double shift bussing tables to help cover my own school fees, and I found the kitchen refrigerator padlocked shut, an actual hardware store padlock looped through the door handle and the side vent, because my mother had decided groceries were for people contributing to this household, and in her math, a daughter who cost more than she earned didn't qualify. Preston, 16 at the time, sat at the counter eating a steak dinner she'd cooked for him an hour earlier, not once looking up. I didn't cry that night either. I just went to my room, pulled that recruiter's card out of my sock drawer, and dialed the number before I'd even taken my shoes off. Some people run away from home toward nothing in particular. I ran toward the first place in my life that promised to feed me for showing up and doing the work, and never once asked whether I was worth it first. That's why I built Winters Hollow. 11 years of combat pay, hazard pay, and a royalty stream nobody in my family knew existed. I'd co-developed a battlefield hemostatic wound dressing during my second deployment, something soldiers now called the Winters Wrap, licensed to a medical supply company for a small percentage that, over a decade of wartime contracts, had quietly made me a wealthier woman than my mother's entire social circle combined. I never told her. I never told anyone outside 2 lawyers and my own bank, because I had learned at 9 years old exactly what my family did with money they knew I had. I used that money to buy 41 acres of Shenandoah Valley farmland and turn it into a working ranch and recovery program for wounded veterans, amputees, burn survivors, men and women carrying invisible wounds nobody gave them a Purple Heart for. Physical therapy in a barn I built with my own hands during 2 months of convalescent leave. Equine therapy with rescued horses. A bunkhouse for veterans between housing. It was the only thing in my adult life that was purely, entirely mine, built for people who had given everything the way I had, and asked for nothing in return. And my mother had turned it into a fundraising prop for her own son's inheritance, before my body was even confirmed cold. Ashford was still watching me across that low table, waiting to see what I'd do with all of it. Calling the general's office to demand a correction would have been easy. So would calling a lawyer to file an emergency injunction. I did neither. Not yet. Here is where I need you to understand the choice I made, because it's the choice this entire story turns on. I could have walked into that gala Saturday afternoon in my dress uniform and stopped this in 30 seconds with a single phone call to Casualty Affairs. Instead, I asked General Ashford for one thing: 48 hours and his silence. Because a woman who forges her own daughter's death certificate for money doesn't stop being dangerous just because the daughter turns out to be alive. She adapts. She lies faster. And I did not survive 8 months in places that don't exist on maps by walking into rooms without knowing exactly what's waiting in them. If I was going to bring this down, I was going to bring down every piece of it at once. The forged signature, the insurance fraud, the stolen deed, and whoever inside the VA claim system had greased that death notification through in record time. I wasn't going to give them a warning shot. I was going to give them a closed door. That night, I didn't check into a hotel. I drove, quietly, in a rental with dealer plates nobody would recognize, to a ridge overlooking my own farm. And I sat in the dark with a pair of thermal binoculars, watching event trucks roll up my own gravel drive, watching strangers hang string lights across the porch, where I used to sit with wounded men who couldn't sleep, teaching them to breathe again, one exhale at a time. Through the kitchen window, lit up gold against the coming night, I watched my mother laugh with a wine glass in her hand, while 3 caterers arranged a memorial table with a photograph of me in dress uniform, the same photograph the Army uses for funerals, propped up next to a donation box with a slotted lid, hand-lettered, "Continue Elena's Legacy." Standing beside her, adjusting his cufflinks in the window's reflection, like a man rehearsing for a role, was Roland Pruitt. I couldn't hear them from the ridge, not yet. But I didn't need to hear them to know exactly what kind of conversation 2 people have while they polish silverware over a stolen inheritance. I needed proof. And to get proof, I needed to get inside my own house without either of them ever knowing I'd been there. Here's something people don't know about combat medics who spend enough time embedded with special operations units. You don't just learn trauma medicine. You learn the entire operational envelope around the people you're keeping alive. Communications, surveillance, breach and clear protocols, because the difference between a medic who survives to treat the next casualty and one who becomes a casualty herself is often exactly that kind of cross-training. 3 years earlier, before my last deployment, I'd had a full smart security system installed at Winters Hollow. Cameras in every barn, motion sensors on every gate, a central hub I could access from anywhere in the world with the right credentials, because I was running a program for vulnerable veterans, and I took their safety as seriously as I'd taken any mission. Roland, in his infinite greed and zero technical competence, had never thought to change the passwords. Why would he? As far as he knew, the woman who set that system up was 6 feet under a headstone with her name on it. At 11:40 that night, from the front seat of a rental car parked a half-mile down a dirt access road, I opened my laptop, connected through an encrypted tunnel, and let myself back into my own farm, like a ghost walking through her own front door. The first thing I did was the least dramatic thing imaginable. I just watched. I pulled up the barn's overnight camera feed and found Roland alone in what used to be my office, now converted into a makeshift event command center, papers spread across my desk. I zoomed the lens as far as it would go and watched him photograph a document with his phone, hands moving fast, nervous, the exact posture of a man double-checking his own crime before he commits to it in public. I couldn't read the paper from that angle, but I recognized the letterhead, Continental Eagle Life Assurance, the insurer that had underwritten my SGLI policy. At 12:15 in the morning,
My mother walked into that office in a silk robe, wine glass still in hand, and sat on the edge of my desk like she owned the air in the room. My cameras don't just record video, they pick up audio clean enough to use in a deposition, which is exactly what I intended to do with it.
"Relax, Roland," she said, and I want you to hear the exact temperature of her voice, because it is the temperature of every conversation she ever had about me. Bored. Administrative. The examiner already signed off. Cy Renner processed it through as a combat theater confirmation. No body required, no autopsy flag. By Monday, the money's in the trust account and this whole circus is over. "It's $400,000 for a memorial, Judith," Roland said. And even through a laptop speaker, 8 months of buried anger in me went very, very still. That's before we even touched the deed. The land alone is worth $2.2 million once Halberg Development gets their hands on it. Water rights, road frontage, 41 acres they've been trying to assemble for 3 years. We flip it inside 18 months, split it 3 ways, and Preston never has to work a day he doesn't want to. My mother laughed, a small, satisfied sound I'd heard my entire childhood, usually right after she'd gotten exactly what she wanted from someone who trusted her. "She never even used this place for anything but strays," she said. "Cripples and burnouts, playing farmer with government checks. At least this way, her death is finally worth something to this family." I sat in that rental car in the dark and let every word land exactly where it was aimed. Because a soldier who flinches at incoming fire gets someone killed, and I had stopped flinching a long time before this. Instead, I did what I have always done under fire. I documented, I calculated, and I planned the extraction. I called 2 people that night. The first was Nathaniel Cross, the only civilian attorney I have ever fully trusted, a man who'd handled the licensing on my patent royalty for 6 years and never once mentioned it to another living soul. I gave him 3 instructions. Freeze every account tied to the Winters Hollow Trust the instant it received a deposit. File an emergency motion to reverse the fraudulent deed transfer the moment I gave the word. And quietly pull every filing Roland Pruitt or Cy Renner had ever submitted through Continental Eagle Life. The second call was to General Ashford. I asked him for one more favor. For Army CID's Financial Crimes Unit to have eyes ready on a specific claims examiner named Cy Renner, effective immediately. The gala was 2 days away. I had, by my count, 40 hours to turn a memorial service into a courtroom. There was one more loose end that surfaced that first day, and it mattered more to me than almost anything else in this story, because it wasn't about my family at all. It was about the man Roland had used as collateral damage on his way to stealing my land. Earl Whitfield, a local contractor who'd spent 3 months rebuilding the therapy barn's roof after a windstorm the winter before my deployment, had never been paid his final $11,000. Roland, acting as estate administrator in the 8 months I'd been presumed dead, had told Earl the account was frozen pending probate, and strung him along with excuses until Earl, a proud man who'd served 2 tours himself decades earlier, quietly began preparing to file a mechanics lien against the farm. A lien that, if it had gone through before I resurfaced, would have made the fraudulent sale to Halberg Development that much easier to justify to a judge. I had Nathaniel Cross cut Earl a check that same afternoon, full amount plus 6 months of interest, hand-delivered with an apology that wasn't mine to give but needed giving anyway. Earl called me himself that evening, voice rough, and said only, "I heard you were dead, ma'am." I told him the reports were exaggerated. He laughed for the first time in what he said had been months, and told me the door to the therapy barn still didn't latch right in cold weather, and he'd be out Monday to fix it, dead or not. I spent the next day doing something my family would never in 100 years believe I was capable of: patience. I stayed off that ridge during daylight, working instead out of a motel room 40 minutes away, going through 8 months of missed correspondence I'd never gotten the chance to read. And it was in that pile of digital wreckage that I found the second betrayal, the one that reached back 12 years, long before any forged death certificate, long before Winters Hollow even existed. 3 years into my career, right after I'd been selected for an accelerated medical command track, the kind of promotion that opens doors for the rest of a career, Army CID opened a formal investigation into me for falsified medical supply requisitions.
Someone had forged my signature across 11 months of paperwork, diverting controlled trauma medications through a civilian pharmacy account that, buried in a shell company 2 layers deep, traced back to an LLC registered under my mother's maiden name. I remembered those months.
I remembered sitting across a folding table from 2 CID agents who looked at me like I was already guilty. Remembered the cold certainty in my chest that my career, the only thing I had ever built for myself, was about to be taken from me for a crime I never committed. It took 9 months, 2 polygraphs, and a volunteer transfer to the most dangerous unit that would take me, because visible heroism is the fastest way to make an investigation quietly disappear, to finally clear my name. I had always assumed, in some unexamined corner of my mind, that it had been a clerical error, a case of mistaken identity, bad luck in a system too big to always get it right. Sitting in that motel room 12 years later, cross-referencing old case files against banking records my lawyer had just pulled, I learned the truth. My mother had forged those requisitions to fund Preston's failed restaurant venture at 22, and when investigators started pulling threads, she had let her own daughter sit under suspicion of federal fraud rather than risk a single question landing anywhere near her. I remembered those 9 months in a way I hadn't let myself remember them in years. The way my hands used to shake before every meeting with counsel, not from fear of prison exactly, but from the specific, quiet terror of watching a life I'd built entirely by myself get pulled apart thread by thread by a system that had already decided I was guilty and simply needed the paperwork to catch up. I remembered a senior officer pulling me aside and telling me, not unkindly, that a formal finding of fraud would likely end any hope of the medical command track I'd worked 6 years to earn. I remembered calling my mother once, exactly once, during that investigation, hoping, the way you keep hoping even after 2 decades of evidence telling you not to, that she might have some insight, some alibi, some scrap of help to offer. She told me she was sure it would sort itself out, and asked in the same breath whether I could wire Preston $400 for a business permit. I hung up and never called her about it again. I solved it myself, the way I'd solved everything since I was 17. She had nearly ended my career, nearly sent me to a military prison, to bankroll a business that closed within a year, and a decade later, she'd forged my death to bankroll her second attempt. I did not cry reading that file. Soldiers who've watched the worst of what people do to each other don't have many tears left over for family. What I felt instead was the last soft, hopeful piece of me, the 9-year-old who used to believe that if she just achieved enough, served enough, bled enough, her mother would finally love her the way she loved Preston. Quietly, permanently, close its eyes. Rage would have been easier, and rage burns hot and sloppy and gets good medics killed. What settled into me instead was the same ice-flat calm I bring to a mass casualty event, the place inside me that doesn't ask why the wound happened, only how to stop the bleeding fastest and cleanest. My mother had spent 30 years treating me like collateral damage in her own life. I decided in that motel room that Saturday she was going to learn exactly what it feels like to be triaged by someone who has stopped caring whether you survive it. Saturday afternoon, the gala began exactly on schedule. String lights I'd watched hung 2 nights earlier came alive against a perfect Shenandoah sky. A quartet played on my porch. 40-some guests in cocktail attire moved across my lawn, holding champagne flutes, murmuring the specific performative sympathy people reserve for tragedies that don't cost them anything. I watched all of it from the tree line behind the north pasture, in dark civilian clothes, completely invisible to a crowd that had already decided I was 6 feet underground. At the center of the porch stood a 60-inch screen, mounted for the occasion, ready to play with the invitation called "A Tribute to Major Elena Winters," in her own words, stitched together, I'd later learn, from old press interviews about the farm. My mother stood beside it in black Chanel, not out of grief, but because black photographs well for a donation drive press release. Roland stood at a podium with a microphone, county commissioners seated in the front row, the Veterans Charity Director poised with a checkbook the size of a dinner tray. "Elena Winters gave everything for this country," Roland said into that microphone, "and I want you to understand that I stood 40 yards away and let him say it.
Let every word roll out across a crowd of people who genuinely believed they were doing something good, because I needed every single one of them as a witness to what came next. And in her memory, her family is honored to announce the Winters Hollow Legacy Initiative, ensuring her mission continues for years to come. Applause. Champagne glasses lifted. My mother dabbed at a dry eye with a monogrammed handkerchief.
I want you to take a second right now and hit like on this video if you've ever watched someone perform grief they never actually felt, and drop the word honor in the comments if you felt a chill reading what came next, because what came next is the part I built for exactly this moment. At 3:47 in the afternoon, I connected to my own farm's network from a laptop hidden in a rucksack at the tree line, and I did 4 things within 11 seconds of each other. 4 actions queued into one command I'd built into the hub's automation the week I installed the system, back when I thought the worst thing that could ever happen on this farm was a break-in. I locked every exterior door on the main house from the smart hub, sealing my mother, Roland, and the podium microphone system inside a perimeter they didn't know existed. I killed the HVAC system across the whole property, so the polite Shenandoah afternoon would start creeping toward uncomfortable within the hour. I disabled the guest Wi-Fi network, so no phone in that crowd could quietly call for help before I was ready. And I hijacked the feed running to that 60-inch memorial screen. The screen flickered. The tribute video died mid-sentence. In its place, time-stamped and clean, ran 41 seconds of security footage from 2 nights earlier. My mother's voice, crystal clear over farm-grade audio, filling a lawn full of donors and commissioners with the words, "At least this way, her death is finally worth something to this family." Roland's voice, right behind it. "We flip it inside 18 months, split it 3 ways." The quartet stopped playing mid-measure. 100 conversations died at once. I watched from the tree line. 40 faces turned from grief to horror to something close to disgust. And I watched my mother's champagne glass slip out of her hand and shatter against the porch boards she'd stood on not 30 seconds earlier, calling herself a grieving mother. In the chaos of that frozen, silent lawn, I caught sight of one more face I recognized. Danny Ruiz, a former combat engineer who'd lost most of his left leg to an IED and most of his will to live somewhere in the 2 years after, before 6 months at Winters Hollow taught him how to stand on a prosthetic and a purpose at the same time. He'd been invited as a success story for the fundraiser, dressed in a borrowed blazer, clearly uncomfortable being paraded in front of donors like a trophy. When the screen switched over and my mother's voice rang out calling men like him cripples and burnouts playing farmer, I watched Danny's jaw tighten, watched him set down his water glass very carefully, the way a man does when he's deciding whether a room is worth staying angry in. He didn't say a word yet. He just looked toward the tree line, like some part of him already knew exactly who was about to walk out of it. That's when I walked out of the tree line. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked across my own pasture in the same unhurried pace I used crossing a triage line, because the entrance a person makes tells a room everything about who's actually in control of it. Someone near the front screamed. Someone else dropped a glass. My mother turned, followed the sound, and I watched something in her go still, and then give way all at once. 30 years of certainty. The certainty that she had gotten away with something, again, the way she always had, collapsing in real time. "That's not possible," she whispered, loud enough that the microphone Roland was still frozen behind picked it up and threw her voice across the entire lawn. "You're dead. We had the letter. We had the—" "You had a forged casualty notification," I said, close enough now that I didn't need volume, "processed by an insurance examiner you paid off, on the deed to a farm you stole with a signature that isn't mine, 2 days after you buried an empty casket for $400,000. I let that settle across a lawn full of the exact donors and officials whose approval she'd built her entire performance around. Everyone here just heard you say my death was finally worth something to this family. I'd like them to hear the rest of it too." I turned to Roland, who had gone the particular shade of gray men go when they realized the exit they were counting on has already been sealed. "Mr. Pruitt, Cy Renner is currently being interviewed by Army CID's Financial Crimes Division regarding 11 fraudulent casualty processing files, yours included.
Continental Eagle Life froze the $400,000 disbursement 40 minutes ago on my attorney's request, backed by a federal fraud flag. And the quitclaim deed you filed on my farm was voided this morning by an emergency court order, because it turns out you can't legally sign over land belonging to a woman who is, provably, standing in front of you right now.
I have watched a lot of men break under pressure, in interrogation rooms, in field hospitals, in the specific silence that falls right before someone finally tells you the truth. Roland Pruitt broke the fastest I've ever seen. He turned to my mother, in front of 3 county commissioners and a room full of witnesses, and said the only sentence a coward like him was ever going to say. This was her idea, all of it. I told her it was too risky. I told her, Judith, tell them I just handled the paperwork. My mother tried, for just a moment, to be the woman who talked her way out of every consequence for 30 years. This isn't what it looks like, she said, straightening her spine, reaching for the same practiced brightness she used at every fundraiser she'd ever chaired. We were protecting her legacy. Ask anyone here. Ask the commissioners. This was always meant to honor her. Nobody on that lawn was buying it. I watched her hear how hollow it sounded, even to herself. My mother's mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time in my entire life, I watched her run out of a version of the truth flexible enough to save her. The county commissioners were already on their phones. The veterans' charity director had gone pale and was quietly, deliberately, closing the checkbook she'd brought to donate against a lie. And somewhere in the back of that crowd, I got sight of my Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister, who had known about the forged CID requisitions 12 years earlier and said nothing, who had spent this entire event standing near the dessert table, looking like a woman waiting for an exit she didn't have the nerve to take, turn white as printer paper, and quietly walk toward her car. I let her go. Patricia's cowardice had cost me a career I nearly lost once already, but cowardice and forgery aren't the same crime, and I had bigger fish already frying on the line.
Nathaniel Cross arrived 12 minutes later. I'd choreographed his timing to the minute, walking up my own driveway in a gray suit with a folder under his arm, and the calm, unhurried gait of the man who has never once lost a case he actually wanted to win. Behind him, 2 unmarked sedans pulled in, and 4 agents from Army CID's Financial Crimes Unit stepped out, along with a county sheriff's detective named Mara Booth, who I'd worked with years earlier when a veteran at my farm survived an attempted assault, and she'd been the only officer in the county who took it seriously.
Behind Detective Booth's car, a 3rd vehicle rolled to a stop, and General Thomas Ashford stepped out in his dress uniform, 4 stars catching the afternoon light. He hadn't needed to come himself. A phone call would have done it. But he told me, back in that debrief lounge 3 days earlier, that a soldier who gets buried alive by her own family and climbs back out deserves to have someone from her real family standing there when the truth finally lands. And General Ashford has never once in 11 years broken a promise to me. He didn't say anything to my mother. He didn't have to. He simply stood at my shoulder, hands clasped behind his back, and let 30 years of earned authority radiate off him in a way that made every donor still frozen on that lawn understand, without a word being spoken, exactly which of the 2 women standing in front of them the United States Army actually stood behind. Judith Halloway, Roland Pruitt. Detective Booth didn't raise her voice either. She didn't need to. The entire lawn had gone dead silent. 40 witnesses standing frozen with half-eaten canapes in their hands. We have a warrant to search this property in connection with insurance fraud, forgery, and falsification of federal casualty records. My mother's knees actually buckled. Not theatrically. I want to be clear about that, because I know how theatrical she could be when it served her. This was 30 years of getting away with things landing on her all at once, in front of the only audience she'd ever actually cared about impressing. Here's a detail I need you to sit with for a moment, because it's the one that still catches in my chest even now. As agents moved through my mother's purse and found, tucked behind a compact mirror, a folded printout of my SGLI beneficiary designation form, marked up in her own handwriting with notes on which line to forge, Preston stepped out from behind a hedge at the edge of the property, my half-brother, the golden son this entire scheme had been built to fund. He had been there the whole time, hiding, watching his mother's empire collapse from a safe distance, the same way he'd always let other people absorb the consequences of choices made in his name. He didn't come to defend her.
He came to save himself. "I didn't know," he said, loud enough for the agents to hear, hands already raised before anyone asked him to raise them. "I swear to God, I didn't know about any of it. Ask her. Ask Roland. I just wanted the farm to stay in the family."
My mother turned to look at him, at the boy she had sacrificed everything for, twice, 12 years apart. And I watched something in her finally, completely break. Not guilt, not remorse, just the horrifying arithmetic of realizing that the son she'd forged federal documents to protect had thrown her to a county detective in under 4 seconds to protect himself. I want you to take a second here and comment the word karma if you've ever watched a family's whole house of lies collapse in on itself the moment the pressure finally hit. Because what I'm about to tell you is the part where it gets worse for them and better for every veteran who ever slept a full night in my bunkhouse because of the farm they tried to steal. While agents secured the scene, I walked to the porch, my porch, and picked up the microphone Roland had abandoned mid-collapse. I picked it up because I owed the truth to 40 people who'd shown up genuinely wanting to honor a woman they thought was dead, and I wasn't going to let the last thing they remembered about Winters Hollow be a fraud. "My name is Major Elena Winters," I said, and I watched confusion turn slowly into something closer to respect across that lawn. 8 months ago, I was declared killed in action during a classified operation. That declaration was an administrative error. The Army corrected within days. What took 8 months was my own mother deciding it was more profitable to let that error stand than to tell the truth. I gestured toward the barn behind me, where 3 of my veterans, men who'd walked out mid-gala to see what the commotion was, one on a prosthetic leg, one with a service dog pressed against his knee, stood watching in silence. This farm exists because people like them needed somewhere to land when the country that sent them to war forgot to catch them coming home. It was never for sale. It was never a legacy project. It was never a headline. And it is not, and will never be, for the family standing in handcuffs behind me. The applause that followed wasn't performative. I could tell the difference, because I'd spent the last 20 minutes watching the performative kind. In the days that followed, the collapse moved with a speed my mother had never once considered, because women like her live their entire lives believing consequences are something that happen to other people. I watched most of it from the farm, in between physical therapy sessions and fence repairs, the way you watch weather roll in over someone else's house. Cy Renner, the insurance examiner Roland had paid to fast-track a fraudulent casualty confirmation, was arrested within 48 hours, and facing federal charges, immediately began cooperating, handing investigators a paper trail that connected 11 other fraudulent claims, stretching back 4 years, all run through the same small, quiet corruption Roland had built his entire second income around. Continental Eagle Life didn't just freeze the $400,000 meant for my estate. Their internal fraud division opened a full audit of every claim Roland Pruitt had ever touched as a financial consultant. And by the following month, 3 other grieving families discovered heat skimmed commissions off their real, legitimate claims for years, quietly, the way men like him always do. A little here, a little there. Never enough for any one family to notice, until it added up to something that finally got him noticed by everyone at once. Nathaniel Cross moved just as fast on the civil side. The quitclaim deed was voided permanently as a matter of law. You cannot forge away land from someone who's still alive to say no, and ownership reverted to me outright. That same week, on Nathaniel's advice, I finally did what I probably should have done years earlier. I moved Winters Hollow into an irrevocable trust my mother would never have access to or even visibility into again. The IRS, alerted to the insurance fraud, opened its own audit into the Holloway household's finances and discovered what a decade of quiet greed usually leaves behind: undeclared income from Roland's skimmed commissions, a second mortgage taken against a house Preston's failed restaurant had never come close to justifying, and years of returns that didn't remotely match the lifestyle Judith Holloway had built her entire social identity around. My mother's friends, the country club board she'd chaired, the charity circuit she'd spent 30 years cultivating like a garden made entirely of appearances, did exactly what I expected people like that to do the moment a headline turned unflattering. They vanished. Not slowly, all at once, the way a flock of birds lifts off a wire at the same instant, leaving nothing behind but the wire
and the quiet.
A regional paper ran the story under the headline, "Fraud, Not Farewell. Family Faked Soldier's Death for Insurance Payout." And within a week, it had been picked up by 3 larger outlets and half a dozen veterans advocacy accounts online. My mother, a woman who had spent 3 decades building an identity out of what other people thought of her, discovered in real time what it feels like when the only currency you've ever traded in, reputation, is suddenly worth exactly nothing. The country club quietly revoked her membership, pending review, which is the kind of phrase institutions use when they mean permanently and don't want the lawsuit. 2 of the county commissioners who'd sat in that front row issued public statements distancing themselves from the event before the sun had even set that Saturday. The Veterans Charity, whose director had shown up with a checkbook instead, released a statement thanking Major Winters and the true veterans of Winters Hollow for their integrity, and quietly redirected the donation they'd planned for my mother's fraudulent initiative straight to my farm instead. It was, I'll admit, the one part of this entire ordeal that made me laugh out loud, alone, in my truck.
I want to tell you about the day I went back to my mother's house, the house Preston still lived in, the house that hadn't yet been seized as part of the IRS proceedings, because it's the moment this story actually ends for me, even though the legal process took another 8 months to fully resolve.
I drove out on a gray Tuesday, 3 weeks after the gala, in the same plain civilian clothes I'd worn on the ridge the night I first watched them polishing silver over my grave. My mother answered the door herself. No housekeeper anymore, I'd later learn, because there was no money left to pay one. She had aged in 3 weeks the way people only age under genuine, uncushioned consequence. No pearls, no Chanel, just a woman in a cardigan, standing in a doorway that still, technically, belonged to a bank now.
Elena, she said my name like she was testing whether it still worked. I know you probably came to... I came to give you something, I said, and I watched hope flicker across her face, ugly and immediate, the exact same hope I'd watched flicker across it my entire childhood, every time she thought there was still an angle to work. I reached into my jacket and pulled out 2 things, a single dollar bill and a folded printout, the 11-month CID investigation file from 12 years earlier, the one that had nearly ended my career, with her forged signature circled in red on every page, and a cover letter from Nathaniel Cross, confirming that I had, that morning, formally declined to press separate criminal charges for that specific fraud, given the statute of limitations concerns, and more honestly, because I had decided I no longer needed the courtroom to know I had been right.
I placed both in her hand. "The dollars for whatever this family still thinks it's owed from me," I said. "The files so you finally have to look at it instead of me tarrying it for you." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked back to my car, and I did not look back. Because the girl who used to look back, who used to hope that just one more good deed, one more sacrifice, one more act of service might finally earn her mother's love, had been buried a long time before that fake headstone ever went in the ground. And unlike me, she was never coming back.
6 months later, Judith Holloway pled guilty to insurance fraud and falsification of federal records, receiving 4 years in federal prison and full restitution obligations she will realistically spend the rest of her life working off. Roland Pruitt, facing the combined weight of 11 fraud counts, took a plea agreement that kept him out of trial and put him behind bars for 6 years. The insurance licensing board revoked his certification permanently, which meant that even after release, the only income stream he'd ever known would never legally exist for him again. Cy Renner cooperated his way into a reduced sentence, but not reduced enough to save the career, the license, or the marriage he lost somewhere in the middle of it.
Preston never faced charges. He also never faced consequences of any kind that didn't involve losing access to money he hadn't earned, which, if you'd asked 9-year-old me, would have sounded like exactly the kind of justice this family understood best. Last I heard, he was working retail in a town 2 counties over, and Patricia, my aunt, the woman who'd known about the forged CID files 12 years earlier and said nothing, sends me a Christmas card every year that I have never once opened. I want to close this out by telling you what happened to the farm, because that's the part of this story that actually matters, more than any of the people who tried to take it from me. Winters Hollow is still standing, Bigger now, actually. The Winters Wrap royalty income I'd kept hidden my whole life, the money my family never even knew existed, funded a second bunkhouse, a proper physical therapy building, and a scholarship fund for veterans' children I named after the boy Roland tried to tell everyone I was building a legacy for. Except I named it after nobody in my family. I named it Second Watch, because the men and women who come through that farm spent their first watch protecting this country, and the least this country's citizens owe them is someone standing a second watch over their recovery. I still get up before dawn most mornings and walk the property line myself, the way I did the night I sat on that ridge watching strangers hang string lights over my own grief. Some mornings I pass the exact spot where I stood watching my mother lift a wine glass and call my death finally worth something. I don't feel rage there anymore. I feel something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds. Because if she hadn't tried to bury me, I might never have found out exactly how much of my life I had spent trying to earn love from someone who was never capable of giving it, and exactly how much peace was waiting for me the moment I finally stopped trying. They declared me dead on paper for 8 months. It took them exactly one memorial screen turning on to learn that some people don't stay buried, and some deaths, the 12-year-old kind, the kind built out of forged signatures and stolen childhoods, don't have a statute of limitations on the day they finally come due. A wound doesn't heal because you ignore it, and a family doesn't earn forgiveness just because they share your blood. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't running toward gunfire. It's finally walking away from the people who taught you that love was something you had to bleed for. If someone in your life has ever tried to profit off your absence, your pain, or your silence, I hope you find whatever version of that screen turning on looks like for you. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe for more, and tell me down in the comments, have you ever had to cut ties with family who only valued you for what they could take? How did you find the strength to finally choose yourself? I read every single comment, and I'd be honored to hear your story.